მადლობა მობრძანებისთვის, მადლობა ინტერესისთვის, შანს რომ დღევანდელი სტუმარი მართლაც მნიშვნელოვან თემაზე ისაუბრებს და მნიშვნელოვანი ორგანიზაციის წარმომადგენელია და თავადაც აქვს უაღრესად მნიშვნელოვანი ცოდნა და გამოცდილება იმ სფეროში, რომელზეც დღეს ის ისაუბრებს. I will do the introduction in Georgian if you don't mind, but whatever I'm going to say, you already know. ძალიან მოხარულები ვართ, რომ მისი ლექციის შემდეგ ჩვენ მას მივანიჭებთ ილიას სახელმწიფო უნივერსიტეტის საპატიო დოქტორობას. ეს იყო ბატონი დავით თარხნიშვილის ინიციატივა, რომელიც გახლავთ საბუნებისმეტყველო და საინჟინრო მეცნიერებების დეკანი ჩვენს უნივერსიტეტში და უნივერსიტეტის როგორც აკადემიური წარმომადგენლობით საბჭო სიამოვნებით დაეთანხმა ამ ინიციატივას. მე მინდა ვთქვა, რომ ბატონი ჯონ სკანლონი არის CITES-ის საერთაშორისო კონვენციის გადაშენების პირას მყოფი ველური ფაუნისა და ფლორის სახეობებით სავაჭრო ვაჭრობის შესახებ კონვენცია ქვია ამას და მისი აბრევიატურაა CITES-ის და მომავალში ასე მოიხსენიებ ხოლმე. გენერალური მდივანი ან გენერალური დირექტორი ან აღმასრულებელი მდივანი გააჩნია როგორ გვინდა ვთქვათ. ეს კონვენცია ძალაში შევიდა 1975 წელს, საქართველოს მას შეუერთდა 1996 წელს და მისი მიზანია, რომ ეს ველური ფაუნისა და ფლორის სახეობებით საერთაშორისო ვაჭრობა ისე იყოს რეგულირებული, რომ მის არსებობას მათ არსებობას საფრთხე არ შეექმნას. ბატონი ჯონ სკანლონი არის უაღრესად გამოცდილი ადამიანი, ესე იგი გარემოსა და მდგრადი განვითარების სფეროში, რაც შეეხება პოლიტიკას, სამართალს, ინსტიტუციებსა და მმართველობას. მას აქვს გამოცდილება შეძენილი აქვს როგორც სამთავრობო, ისე საერთაშორისო და ლოკალურ დონეებზე, იყო ბევრი საერთაშორისო საზოგადოების წარმომადგენელი, იყო ავსტრალიის სახელმწიფოში სწორედ ამ მიმართულებით ბევრი ინსტიტუტის ხელმძღვანელი და შესაბამისად აქვს ასევე ძალიან საინტერესო აკადემიური გამოცდილებაც. დღეს ის ისაუბრებს სწორედ ამ კონვენციაზე CITES-ის შესახებ. დარწმუნებული ვარ, რომ ჩვენთვის იქნება ძალიან საინტერესო, ჩვენ გვექნება საშუალება დაუსვათ მათ შეკითხვები ან ჩვენი აზრი გამოვთქვათ იმის შესახებ, რასაც ის იტყვის და შემდგომ უკვე იქნება ასეთი მოკლე საზეიმო ცერემონია. ახლა კი დიდი სიამოვნებით სიტყვას გადავცემ ბატონ ჯონ სკანლონს.
Thank you very much, Rector Zadania, and to Acting Dean Taknishvili. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Ilyas State University this afternoon. As you know, we are here this week because the government of Georgia is hosting the 22nd meeting of the CITES Plants Committee, and it's going on as we speak. And that's given me the opportunity as Secretary General of CITES to make my first visit to the beautiful city of Tbilisi here in Georgia. And I'm very grateful to you, Rector, and to the staff of the Environment Agency for giving an opportunity for me to speak to a gathering such as this afternoon and to talk to you about what CITES is, what it does and what it does not do. It's also great while the World Cup rugby is being played to be here in Georgia. As the Rector said, I am an Australian national and we're still in the competition, but Georgia had a fantastic competition this year and you've automatically qualified for the next World Cup, so congratulations. We get a lot of questions from the media and the general public about CITES to ask us what sort of trade it's regulating, why it isn't regulating other trade, etc. And this afternoon I'm going to give you a sense of what the convention is. But firstly, the origins of the convention. Before CITES was adopted in Washington, D.C. in 1973, there were no regulatory controls at the global level regarding trade in wildlife, which meant that any country was free to trade with any other country in its wildlife in any quantity at any time without any oversight by the global community. In 1963, an organisation called IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, said we need to have some regulatory controls here because if left unregulated, international trade could drive some species of plants and animals to extinction. without us even knowing it was happening. And at the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm in 1972, one of the recommendations was to conclude negotiations on a treaty to regulate international trade in wildlife. And it was in fact the United States government in 1973 that hosted the plenipotentiary conference where the final text of the convention was negotiated and concluded. And 2 years later, the convention came into force in 1975. And Georgia joined the convention in 1996. So you're going to have your 20th anniversary next year, another good reason for a celebration, and has been a very active party to the convention since that time. In fact, we now have 181 parties, that's 181 countries have joined the convention. The 182nd party is just about to join the convention. And CITES is today, 40 years after it came into force, regarded as one of the most successful international agreements in existence. 2 years ago, the UN General Assembly, in fact, declared the 3rd of March, that was the date upon which CITES was adopted, as World Wildlife Day. So on the 3rd of March every year, we celebrate a UN day called World Wildlife Day. I don't know, have you been celebrating it here in Georgia? Next year, in 2016, on the 3rd of March, we look forward to seeing big celebrations, including at the zoo, to celebrate World Wildlife Day. We have had the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, President of the General Assembly, and many others become very engaged in this day. So how does CITES work then? CITES is an international agreement. It places obligations on countries, including Georgia, to do certain things. But it is not a self-executing instrument, which means that in order to have national effect, you need national laws. And so we have a global framework put in place by the Convention, and each of the countries are responsible for meeting those obligations. One unique aspect, or two unique aspects of CITES are firstly that we are a voting convention. Where there's no consensus, we go to a vote, and a 2/3 majority will carry the day. And that's one reason why the convention has evolved over time. And secondly, we have compliance processes, which means that if a state fails to meet its obligations, our committee, known as the Standing Committee, can review that and can take what we call compliance measures. They're not sanctions, but in general terms you could say sanctions, and it can result in the Standing Committee recommending a suspension of trade in relation to a country, suspending it from trading in a particular CITES species or all CITES species. And we have about 30 trade suspensions in place at the moment. It's not a theoretical compliance mechanism, it is an actual compliance mechanism. And by way of example, Guinea in Africa has a complete trade suspension in place. It cannot trade commercially in any CITES listed species because of failure to meet a number of requirements of the convention. CITES is both a trade convention and a conservation convention, and it in fact uses trade measures to achieve its conservation objectives. And today we regulate international trade in over 35,000 species of plants and animals. The vast majority, around 29,000, are plants and around 6,000 are animal species. The trade that does take place is trade for a number of purposes. It can be trade in timber that's used in furniture. It's trade, it finds its way into medicines, finds its way into food, cosmetics, clothes, etc. Because the convention controls not only trade in the raw item, but in the parts and derivatives. So if part of a wildlife product finds itself into a medicine, it is regulated. For certain species, international commercial trade is prohibited. These are found on what we call Appendix 1, and these species are regarded as already being threatened with extinction. And the convention prohibits any commercial trade in those species. It is only around 3% or 1,000 of the species regulated under CITES, but as I said, they are already threatened with extinction and there can be no trade in them. Some examples: you cannot trade in elephant ivory, you cannot trade in rhino horn, in tigers or tiger parts, in great apes or in marine turtles. They all find themselves on Appendix 1. No commercial trade is allowed. The majority of the species, about 96% of them, are found on what we call Appendix 2. That's around 34,000 species. And these are species that are not necessarily threatened with extinction now, but they could become threatened if we don't strictly regulate their trade. So if you like, it's an early expression of the precautionary approach. To avoid them becoming threatened, you put them on Appendix 2, strictly regulate their trade so that they don't find themselves driven towards extinction. Some examples of trade here: there are high volumes of commercial trade in crocodile and python skins. They find themselves into many clothing products, watch straps, bags, shoes, coats, etc. The meat of the queen conch. The queen conch is a shellfish which is fished in the Caribbean. It's very popular. The meat is very popular in the southern part of the United States. That is a regulated species. The wool of the vicuña. I don't know, do you have any vicuña in the zoo? I saw some llama there, but the vicuña, it's a small llama type species. It's found in Latin America, countries such as Peru. Very fine wool, and the wool of the vicuña is traded in high volumes. And also the bark of the African cherry tree. The bark of the African cherry tree has medicinal properties. It's found in countries such as Cameroon. It's used to make prostate medicine, and it is traded between Cameroon, for example, Belgium and France, where it is used for converting in particular medicinal properties. While all species under CITES are treated the same, so all 35,000 species of plants and animals are treated the same, we as human beings don't necessarily treat all species of plants and animals the same. And we find that some of the megafauna, elephant, rhino, whales, great apes, attract perhaps more attention and attract attention in different ways, not just relating to conservation. While CITES regulates trade in these 35,000 species, in some cases to prohibit commercial trade, in other cases to strictly regulate it, the Convention does not promote trade and it does not discourage trade. Rather, it regulates trade to make sure when it does take place that it is legal, it is sustainable and it is traceable. And under the Convention on Biological Diversity, states have the sovereign right to exploit their own natural resources, including their biological resources, subject, of course, to their international commitments. And that includes their commitments under CITES. As I mentioned, we are a voting convention. We're now 42 years old from the date of adoption and 40 years old from the date of entry into force. And the world has changed quite significantly from 1975. Population in 1975 was about 4 billion. It's now over 7 billion. That's another 3 billion potential consumers of biodiversity and wildlife products. And we've seen an extraordinary expansion in technology, in the ability to transport. There are now 100,000 flights that take off every day. There are now 500 million shipping containers whizzing around the planet every year. And last year there was 1.1 billion tourist arrivals in the course of a year. We are connected globally like we've never been before. And this convention is in fact more relevant now than it was in 1975 to ensure that international trade is not going to drive species to extinction. And what we are seeing is that more and more species are being added, in particular timber species. We've gone from about 20 species in 1975 to over 600 timber species today. 300 were added at our last major meeting in 2013, including all of Madagascar's commercially valuable timber species. And we're seeing additional marine species being added to CITES. At our last conference in 2013, 5 commercially harvested sharks were added to the convention to regulate the trade in their fins and in their meat. These are significant changes for the convention, and it represents an evolution of the convention over time. And CITES is now increasingly recognised as a Sustainable Development Convention. And at the Rio summit they had in 2012, that you're probably familiar with, the UN Convention on Sustainable Development, held in Rio in 2012, there was a specific paragraph, paragraph 203, that describes CITES as an international agreement that stands at the intersection between trade, the environment, and development. And that's a very good description of the convention. We've also seen the UN General Assembly pass the first dedicated resolution on tackling illicit trafficking in wildlife. They did that on 29th of July this year. Again, in that resolution, they recognised the implications for sustainable development of illicit trafficking, and the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted just 2 weeks ago in New York include 2 specific targets on combating illegal trade in wildlife. So I said before, CITES is a conservation and a trade convention. Given we're a trade convention, how do we relate to the World Trade Organization and the WTO rules? Are we working counter the WTO? Are we subject to disputes under the WTO? The reality is that over the 40 years of CITES and the 20 years of the World Trade Organization and the gap that preceded it, there's never been a dispute taken about a CITES trade measure to regulate international trade. And we just released a publication with the Director General of the WTO on why is that? Why is that CITES, which limits and restricts the ability to trade, has managed to coexist harmoniously with the world trade regime? And it's basically because it is a rules-based, science-based, open and transparent convention that regulates trade in a manner that is completely compliant with the exemptions under the World Trade Organization. And I'd recommend you take a look at that particular publication to show how the trade regime and this regime that regulates trade in wildlife have managed to work so successfully together. Now, when a country decides it wants to trade in wildlife, such as Georgia wants to trade in the snowdrop, the bulb of the snowdrop, there are certain preconditions that have to be met. Now, this is trade in Appendix 2 species, not in Appendix 1, in Appendix 2. There are 3 primary obligations that a state has to comply with. Firstly, if it's going to trade, it has to make a legal acquisition finding. That means that it has to make a specific finding that the taking of that species, be it a plant or an animal, is legal. It's taken in accordance with national law. The second relates to sustainability, and that is that before you trade, the scientific authority, the designated scientific authority, has to do what's called a non-detriment finding. That means it has to make a specific finding that taking a particular number of species from the wild will not be detrimental to its survival. And that finding is binding on the management authority that issues the permit. And thirdly, the trade needs to be reported to the Secretariat, needs to be reported to us as a CITES Secretariat, and we will put it in our trade database, which is publicly available. We have records of about 15 million trade transactions in our trade database. It's all publicly available, and you can search to see which country is trading with which other country, in what species, and in what volume. They are the 3 critical preconditions to trade. And trade has had traditionally, in certain instances, great benefits both for wildlife and for local people. I mentioned the vicuña in Latin America. The vicuña was almost driven to extinction by illegal hunting. There were only around 5,000 vicuña left in the wild. The 5 range states got together and they decided that they needed to find a way to manage the vicuña population, to give local people some interest in the local population, in the management of the species. What they did is it went from Appendix 1 to Appendix 2. They gave local people, in particular in Peru, rights to take the animals, to shear them, and then release them back to the wild. We now have almost 400,000 vicuña in the wild, and there are many local communities where local people are being employed through taking the vicuña. In one Peruvian village alone, there are around 900 people employed directly and indirectly through the taking and the sale of vicuña wool. And a vicuña suit, I'm not wearing one, but a vicuña suit can cost up to $50,000. My wife was just in Milan and she said, I look for a scarf for you. There was a vicuña scarf. It was €4,000. She didn't buy me one. But that is it's a fine wool, and it's been a great example of the benefits to wildlife and people of well-regulated trade. But we have another excellent example, and this is one of the best examples in the world as well, and that is how Georgia has gone about the trade in the snowdrop. This is a species, as you know, it's found in the wild here, it's harvested in the wild, and working with the Management Authority, the Science Authority, and with our Plants Committee, measures were put in place to ensure that the harvest of the snowdrop from the wild was done at a sustainable level. And I think it's about 15 million are exported per year now, with benefits for local people. And that's a great example, and one of the examples we used to show how you can, through well-regulated trade, have an industry, but at the same time ensure survival of the species in the wild. And we very much commend the Georgian authorities for what it achieved there, both for wildlife and for local people. Under the Convention, we also have a process called the Review of Significant Trade. So our Animals and Plants Committees review the volumes of trade. They look to see whether or not levels of trade look too high, and if they do, they call it into the committee process, and they inquire of a country, why are the levels of trade at this level? Are they too high, etc.? And if they do believe they are too high, they can recommend to the Standing Committee that there be a trade suspension. And we have had a number of cases where that has happened. The Science Committees believe that trade is too high, and our Standing Committee, our Compliance Committee, then prohibits all trade until things are put on a sustainable footing. And with this, we have seen great links between wildlife, the management of trade, and local livelihoods and benefits to local people. Because ultimately, we need to find a way of ensuring that local people have a vested interest in their wildlife to ensure that they are the strongest protectors of it. One of the issues that crops up a lot and attracts a lot of public attention is the issue of animal welfare and animal rights. And this is with respect to trade in animals, obviously, not in plants. It achieved a lot of attention recently with the killing of a lion named Cecil in Zimbabwe. Did that get much attention here in Georgia? That generated a lot of attention, a lot of interest in issues to do with animal welfare and animal rights. And it is an area where we have a lot of active groups participating in our convention processes. And the issue has been, to what extent does CITES address animal welfare and animal rights, if at all? It is a conservation convention. The primary objective is the survival of the species of the wild and ensuring that when species are taken from the wild, that it doesn't in any way limit the ability of that species to survive or have a detrimental impact on the services it provides to the ecosystem. But animal welfare issues have been written into the Convention for some time. Live transport in animals within the Convention text itself has always had provisions about minimising the risk to injury, damage to health or cruel treatment to species that are traded as live animals. We've also had specific provisions about ranching of crocodiles. There have been written into the Convention for some time certain provisions about animal welfare. However, what the international community has done is, while it's recognised some animal welfare issues deserve international attention, such as how they're transported, the vast majority of them have been left to the national level. So the vast majority of animal welfare issues are left at this stage by the international community to national choice, domestic choice. And with respect to animal rights, we don't see any movement at the international level for dealing with animal rights, but certainly on the animal welfare issue, we see some movement. And in fact, CITES is the only international agreement that deals with any animal welfare issues. There's no other international agreement that does so. And we don't have any international law beyond that on animal welfare or animal rights. But this is an issue that does generate a huge amount of attention under the Convention. We can deal with some of it, but not all of it. An issue that attracts a huge amount of attention for good reason at the moment is the illegal trade in wildlife. As I said, we have Appendix 1, Appendix 2. You can't commercially trade in Appendix 1. If you do commercially trade in Appendix 1, that is an illegal trade, both internationally and domestically through national legislation. If you trade in Appendix 2 without the necessary permits or certificates, or you have the certificate or permit but it doesn't match what you're trading, that is an illegal trade at international level and national level. So very much when we think about illegal trade in wildlife, it has to breach international and or national law, and CITES is the international instrument that has made it subject to a regulatory regime. And so failing to comply with CITES equals illicit trade or illegal trade in wildlife. It's estimated that illegal trade in wildlife is worth, somebody better grab that, got it? It's estimated today that illegal trade in wildlife is worth around $20 billion per year. And there are some examples I can give you of where we are currently experiencing a spike or a surge in the illegal trade in wildlife as it affects some very charismatic and very valuable species from multiple perspectives. The poaching and illegal trade of the African elephant and its ivory is perhaps one of the most destructive forms of wildlife crime. And we saw over a period of just 3 years, 2012, 13 and 14, an estimated 100,000, that's 100,000 African elephants slaughtered for their ivory. And in some regions, such as Central Africa, the population has dropped by 60% in just 10 years through the poaching and illegal trade. This has put some species, in particular those in some populations of the species, in particular in Central Africa, at imminent risk of extinction. The recovery of the white rhino in South Africa is a great conservation success story. Around 40 years ago, the white rhino was down to about 100. There are only 100 white rhino left. And through great conservation efforts, in particular in South Africa by the public and private sector, there are now about 20,000 white rhino, most of them found in South Africa. It's a great conservation success story. And poaching and smuggling was no longer an issue. In 2007, there were 13 white rhino taken in South Africa for their horn. And that was about the same for the 5 or 10 years before 2007. Then 2008, all of a sudden it went up to about 80. Then it went up and up and up until last year, 1,215 rhino in South Africa alone were killed for their horn. What this is doing is now threatening all of the conservation gains that have been made over many decades in the recovery of the rhino. And these crimes don't only affect this megafauna like the elephant and the rhino. The pangolin, are you familiar with the pangolin? I didn't say they are like an anteater, about this big. They're sought after for their scales and their meat. They're found in Asia. There are 4 species in Asia, 4 in Africa. But there is a huge demand for the meat and the scales. The scale of illegal trade there, we can't even count the number of animals. We look at the weight of seizures of scales and meat. And in one seizure of pangolin meat alone, there were 10 tonnes of meat seized. That's 130 people of my weight in one seizure. And bear in mind, these are very small animals. Extraordinary. We're also seeing industrial scale taking of the rosewood, in particular from Madagascar, but also from Central America and other countries. They're very valuable timber species. It can be legally traded, but it is being wiped out from forests illegally for people that are not prepared to get the permits. I was just in Bangkok, Thailand recently, and the director of national parks there showed me a photograph of a rosewood tree, and they are putting metal spikes next to the tree and wrapping it in metal chains to stop people from taking it. It's the only way they can protect the rosewood, is by wrapping it up in steel. And then we also see other timber species, such as species that produce agar wood producing species. It's this. It's an extract from the wood. It's the most valuable, actually, traded commodity under CITES. 1 kilogram of wood chips of highest quality agar wood can attract $2 million in the international market. Again, you can legally trade this, but there are people who don't want to get the permits and they illegally take it. And this is a problem because when there's such a scale of illegal trade, it completely undermines the legal trade to the point where there will be no trade. The species will go on Appendix 1 and all trade will stop. So we're trying to work with all countries to bring this illegal trade in these timber species to an end and get it on a sustainable footing. There are huge challenges with combating this illegal trade. It's industrial scale. It involves transnational organised criminal gangs, very well organised, very savvy. They make good use of the legal transport system, shipping, airlines, trucks, everything. They use the legal system to smuggle their contraband. We're combating rebel militia groups, sometimes rebel parts of the military. We're dealing with a serious crime that's being propelled at an industrial scale. The good news is we're getting great cooperation from within and outside the UN system. We just had the UN General Assembly resolution, as I mentioned, on this topic. The UN Crime Congress in Doha addressed the issue for the first time this year. The UN Commission Against Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice is dealing with it. And we've created the International Consortium on Combating Wildlife Crimes, CITES, Interpol, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, World Customs Organisation and World Bank, to bring coordinated support to countries to combat this illegal trade and to treat it as a serious crime. And a serious crime is what it is. The role of international law and national law in combating illegal wildlife trade, we sometimes have people push us to say, why isn't the international community intervening? You know that something is going wrong in this country. CITES, why aren't you going in there and arresting these people? We have to remind people the way international law works. International law has set the framework, it sets what is legal and illegal, but enforcement is a domestic or national responsibility. It is only national authorities that can take enforcement action other than with respect to certain crimes that are addressed through the International Criminal Court, but the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court does not extend to wildlife crime or to environmental crimes more generally. So basically that is why we work with countries at a national level to assist them undertake their enforcement responsibilities and to take these issues on. But we have seen great cooperation amongst countries. We've just seen the largest operation ever where 62 countries across Africa, Asia, North America all got together in what was called Operation Cobra to do a concerted effort to combat this illegal wildlife trade. What CITES does, however, have is compliance measures. So if a country is not taking the enforcement action it should, we can take compliance measures, and countries have been prohibited from any trade in CITES where they're failing to effectively enforce the convention. So CITES is a convention that attaches international cooperation with national action. It relies upon that interrelationship between the international community deciding what should be regulated, how it should be regulated, the rules around trade, and then it relies upon national governments to put that into domestic law, recognising the convention has this review process, this compliance process that allows it to intervene in a way that no other convention can in the biodiversity suite of conventions. We rely upon the contributions not only from our parties, our member states and all our partners within and outside of the UN, but we have great contribution by the non-government sector. Organisations that can be hunting organisations, animal rights, animal welfare, sustainable use, conservation, they make an extraordinary contribution towards the work of the convention, and many of them in the context of plants are here this week. So I would like to finish up by using some words of the convention. It is a visionary convention. It is more valuable today, I think, than it was when it was first adopted in 1975. In enabling us to benefit from wild plants and animals. And here I quote from the founding text of the convention itself, from the aesthetic, scientific, cultural, recreational and economic points of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scanlon, for showing us how complex, demanding, and necessary the work done by CITES is. And now I open the floor for one round of questions, because we are kind of limited also in time. David, would you want to ask something, or should we?
I have, but I would prefer to allow the...
Absolutely. So, any questions or comments?
The question is about relation between CITES species listed in the CITES appendixes and IUCN Red List globally threatened species. What is exactly today this relation? Is it something? Because logically, yeah, if species has high threatened ranking in the IUCN Red List, it must be somehow also reflected in CITES appendixes. Yeah, this is the question.
Thank you.
I have a question. How is dynamic about illegal harvesting of animals? Is it improving or over the year?
My question is again about the illegal trade. So, as far as I understood, it's on the rise. And what are the current regulations that are planned to be implemented in the future, like to make it less profitable or, I don't know, less interesting for those people? Because this is not only the issue of politics, but also economy. So what are there any plans in CITES with that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent questions, and I'll take them in reverse order. With respect to the illegal trade and what we're doing about it, we're dealing with both the demand side and the supply side. So on the demand side, how do we suppress the demand that exists for ivory, elephant ivory, for rhino horn, etc.? Now that involves a number of aspects. The illegal trade is driven by greed, it's driven by indifference, and is driven by ignorance. And you need different strategies for each one. For greed, these people don't care whether an elephant dies or a human being dies. They want to make money, they're after profit, and they haven't in anything else. They need to be hit with the hard end of the law. We need to find them, we need to prosecute them, put them in jail, seize their assets. And in that sense, we are working across the system to have wildlife crime treated as a serious crime where it's transnational. That means 4 years imprisonment or more under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime, and the prosecutions are on the rise. China has prosecuted hundreds of people, and it is giving sentences from up to 15 years for people illegally trading in ivory. So there, we have to go there. We also have to take the profit out of it. So we need to work with individuals, and we're working with certain individuals in China in particular, to say that investing in ivory is not a good investment decision, because it's going to go down in value. It's not going to go up in value, because we have forensics that is now available. It can identify the date of the ivory, the origin of the ivory. It will always be known to be illegal. So there, on the greed side, we're going hard with the law and hard with saying this is not going to be profitable over the long term. In terms of ignorance, there are great outreach campaigns going on. They involve a lot of media personalities. His Royal Highness the Duke of Cambridge, Prince William, for example, has been very active as well. So for those who buy just because they don't know, that's about educating people, informing people. For those who are indifferent, it's quite difficult because they just don't care. And so there we're looking at other strategies. But that's the demand side. On the supply side, that is the countries where it comes from, then again, it's been a strong law enforcement effort, but also working with local communities. So how can we more actively engage with local communities, look at alternative livelihoods? Local communities are in fact being abused by external forces that are coming in, exploiting them to take out the wildlife products for themselves, and the big profits go offshore. So there, it's working both on demand, supply, it's looking at law enforcement, it's also looking at public outreach, it's looking at local communities. So that's going on across the board to look at all of those issues, and working across source, transit and destination countries. So it's a blend between hardcore law enforcement, good outreach, and trying to suppress demand. In some countries like Vietnam, where rhino horn has become popular again, Rhino horn was used in traditional Chinese medicine, but for fever, for cooling the blood. It was never used for uses that have now made it popular. Rhino wine, used as a hangover cure, used for purposes that had got nothing to do with traditional Chinese medicine, including aphrodisiac. It was never in traditional Chinese medicine an aphrodisiac. These are myths created by very clever salesmen to sell this rhino horn to people at a high price. So there's a lot of work going on within Vietnam as well to directly address these issues of the myths that are driving demand. Because if they've sold it as a cancer cure, if somebody has cancer or a loved one has cancer and you're convinced it's going to cure them, you will want some. But it's a complete myth and nothing to do with traditional Chinese medicine at all. So there we're rolling that as well. So a lot of effort underway, and what makes us happy is the extent of engagement across the UN system, outside of the UN system, etc., and all of our parties. In terms of is illegal harvesting going up and down, I'd say both. It depends. It's certainly, we have experienced a surge in illegal trade and as it relates to rhino and elephant. That's really gone through the roof. Rosewood has just gone up exponentially. In some others, it's gone down. So the vicuña went down, although we're seeing it come up a little bit. With other species, such as great apes, we saw it go down, although any illegal trade in great apes is highly sensitive. So any number of illegal trade in great apes is of concern. So it's some up, some down, but overall up. Huge surge in illegal trade. And that's why we need such a concerted effort across the board to deal with it. And on the question of the IUCN Red List, the IUCN Red List, as you know, is created by IUCN through its Species Survival Commission. It's a peer-reviewed scientific document that looks at the conservation status of the species. It's dealt with about 80,000 species. And it ranks them. There are 6 categories against which they rank them. But it's a scientific peer-reviewed document by IUCN. In terms of the CITES appendices, they are an intergovernmentally agreed list of species. So for a species to be included on the CITES appendices, it is the 181 parties to the convention decide that they are there on Appendix 1 or Appendix 2, and they can go up or down. And where there's a contentious proposal, it goes to a vote. So the 5 sharks that went on the site, they all went to a vote, and they all got listed this time around. The difference between, so that's a peer-reviewed and an intergovernmental, but also one of the triggers for CITES is it either must be in trade or it could be in trade. So if there's a species that is not in trade and there is no prospect of it being in trade, it doesn't meet the second criteria of CITES, which is biological criteria and trade criteria. But when a proposal is presented to our parties for listing under CITES, the IUCN Red List is one of the key reference points. Where is it in the IUCN Red List? And that is regarded as a highly relevant determinant of whether or not it should be listed under CITES. And we have a great relationship with IUCN and Simon Stewart and everybody at the Species Survival Commission in IUCN. We work very closely together.
Okay. I think that we will have a possibility to interact with Ms. Scanlon in more informal atmosphere after this lecture, sipping some wine perhaps. And but what I would like to do now is to award in the name of Ilia State University our honorary doctorate to Ms. Scanlon for his outstanding contribution to environment protection and sustainable development. And that's what we are going to do now. We will just offer him the robe and the
I'm not used to getting dressed in public. All right. No, missed.
You missed it?
Yep.
Okay.
No, missed it again. There we go.
Okay.
Got it. How do I put this cap on?
Just any way you want it, any way you want. It looks fantastic.
Thank you very much.
So this is
I received these gifts for the Secretariat, and they will find their way into our conference room. And thank you very much, Rector, Acting Dean, colleagues from Government of Georgia and all of you for bestowing this honour upon me. It's very much appreciated. Iلیas State University will get all the recognition it deserves for hosting today's public lecture, and thanks again to the government of and the people of Georgia for hosting our Plants Committee meeting this week. It's been really fantastic. Thank you.